If you asked me at the start of the 2024 hurricane season if we would see a major hurricane within the next 2 weeks, I would have told you that was extremely unlikely and the GFS was in Fantasyland. However, as the days went on and we got a better consensus of the true conditions of the main development region and Caribbean Sea, warning signs were flaring up. You had wind shear dropping rapidly in the eastern Caribbean and western MDR, a massive moisture infusion that pushed all the dry air out of the region, and sea surface temperatures that were untapped since October 2023. These three factors are what led to a late June tropical wave in the MDR developing into a record-breaking hurricane. As Hurricane Beryl barreled through the Windward Islands and Caribbean Sea, it set many records, from becoming the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record to having the highest number of tropical tornadoes associated with it once it eventually hit the United States. Today, I will be going over everything that happened with Beryl, from when it started developing to Storms United's extensive coverage to the pure destruction it caused across the Caribbean and the United States. .160. This is the earliest Category 5 hurricane in history. On June 20th, 2024, while I was preparing for the video I was making, I began to watch several model runs indicating a potential tropical cyclone heading for the Lesser Antilles sometime in late June to early July. This was something rather typical for me to watch, as a late June tropical storm has occurred in that region over the last couple of years and had been a consistent trend over the last 10 years or so. As such, I highlighted that possibility in the video I posted that day, but a monster tropical wave came off last night that we're going to have to pay attention to, because I've been talking to Weather Center Nazario about this, and he thinks that there's might be a possibility for development if the conditions are just right as this approaches the Lesser Antilles. He pointed out some ensemble models that he was showing that this thing could possibly approach the Antilles and allow for some development to happen. We're going to have to pay attention to all of that. At the same time, there wasn't enough evidence that this would be stronger than a tropical storm at the time due to lack of data. While the next few days were relatively quiet in terms of the wave's development, models were gradually picking up on the signal. On June 22nd, Storms United member It's Me Zero posted a GIF of the GFS run indicating the uptick of modeling in the western MDR and Caribbean Sea. While it was still early, considering the models were starting to trend towards development, I reported on it briefly while going over other tropical areas to watch. Now, it's something you can keep a very close eye on, and I'm noticing a few more ensemble models from yesterday showing up in parts of the main development region. So, overall, things are going to get pretty interesting, I will say. If we go ahead and, matter of fact, go out to the whole 240 hours out, we can update that for the European. Interestingly, the Europeans, a lot of these ensembles really start ramping up in the main development region. However, a major escalation of modeling began to ramp up over the next few days that would eventually change everything about this area of interest. On June 25th, a tropical wave that would start it all came off the coast of Africa, and models were starting to ramp up on the strength and development of this system. It became apparent that this would actually become a hurricane contender that could cause impacts to the Lesser Antilles. However, what wasn't known was whether it would track through the Caribbean Sea or if it would go out to sea after hitting the Antilles. An Azores high was developing over the subtropical Atlantic Ocean. However, where it would develop and how strong it would ultimately get was in question. Regardless, this escalation was drawing more attention to the upcoming wave, as the National Hurricane Center would designate it an area of interest at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on June 25th, the first step of this becoming a monster. This wave would quickly organize and develop over the next couple of days, as it would be designated Invest 95L 24 hours after getting tagged, and was quickly approaching the Lesser Antilles. At the same time, models were already calling for the system to become a major hurricane, which was raising alarm bells, as a major hurricane had never happened this early in the season. With these runs, as well as Invest 95L organizing much quicker than anticipated, it became a realistic scenario that the Antilles could get severe impacts from this system. the models were also trending further south toward the Windward Islands, particularly Barbados, St. Lucia, and Point South. This quick escalation was due to a combination of factors, with this tweet from Eric Webb giving us a good idea of what was going on. By late June to early July standards, the overall environment looks unusually conducive for tropical development over the east-central MDR next week. Few easterly waves will get tangled up with a pair of convectively coupled Kelvin waves, favoring much lower than average wind shear, a generally divergent upper-level environment, and high deep layer moisture, all superposed onto an exceptionally warm tropical Atlantic. Recent bullish trends in NWP models are likely real and a response to the leading/ascending phase of the CCKW approaching the tropical Atlantic. By the morning of June 27th, Invest 95L was now anticipated to develop rather than it being a possibility. There was still a 40-70 chance on it by the NHC, but that was because it was expected to develop in the long term. Models were by this point screaming of major development and a strong hurricane scenario on the horizon. Convection was also wrapping around the center of the storm complex and showed banding features already developing. On June 28th, the situation escalated further with a 90-90 tag on 95L by 2 p.m. As a result, Tropical Depression 2 formed at 5 p.m. after the low-level circulation developed around 1,500 miles away from the Lesser Antilles. However, the system was moving at nearly 20 miles per hour, and it would only take a few days for the system to arrive. The first forecast from the NHC called for the system to strengthen to a Category 2 hurricane as it approached the eastern Caribbean Sea. As a result of this development, Storms United went live on my channel that evening to discuss the potential threats of this system and the impacts it was going to bring. Here is the cone that we have pulled up for you from the National Hurricane Center. According to the cone, this is expected to strengthen into a hurricane by Sunday afternoon and then make its approach towards the Windward Islands late Sunday night into Monday morning, going into the afternoon as it approaches the southern Windward Islands over there.
The National Hurricane Center forecast for strength, that is only because they are careful. They actually said if this thing even performs somewhat a little bit, a low and major to a major hurricane is extremely likely with the way this is.
I would say, they're definitely being conservative on this one. They have mentioned in discussion, like you said, how there has been models showing this as a major hurricane. So if we look at the model intensity against in the models, there definitely is a lot of suggestions that this definitely could become a major hurricane. A lot of models show it.
During the stream, we were getting evidence that the tropical depression was actually a tropical storm, as several key indicators began to call it Tropical Storm Beryl.
Cyclonic WX, which is a website that shows real-time systems from ATCF, which is official, by the way, is now showing Tropical Storm Beryl, and maximum wind is at 35 knots or 40 miles an hour. So officially, at least by ATCF and therefore also NHC, by next forecast, this will be Beryl.
We also noticed structural improvements that were an early indicator of rapid intensification. However, the story of the night came at 10 p.m. when the NHC designated Tropical Storm Beryl while on stream, as well as the incredible support you guys were giving us that night. It's not on the map.
The discussions right now.
We got it. Never mind. Never mind. We got Tropical Storm Beryl. We got it. We just don't have the public advisory just yet. The forecast.
Put it on the map.
Oh, here's the discussion. All right. They're holding at 105 miles per hour at 72 and 96 hours. However, the sobering reality was that Beryl was developing much faster than many anticipated, and we had a lot of coverage to go through. Beryl quickly intensified overnight, and by 11 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time, it was a 65-mile-per-hour strong tropical storm. The NHC was now calling for major hurricane strength as it approached the Lesser Antilles. These rapid developments were hard to catch up with, as Beryl was undergoing a rate of intensification unseen for the month of June. Hurricane warnings went into effect for Barbados at 5 p.m., followed by St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadine Islands, and Grenada by 11 p.m. Beryl reached hurricane strength at 5 p.m. with no signs the intensification was slowing down. The structure continued to improve, and with limited wind shear and the storm being situated in a major area of moist air, it wasn't expected to weaken. Beryl was also moving at 20 miles per hour at this point, and normally at this speed, this is where storms can get in their own way and start to weaken or at least plateau in strength. This was not the case for this beast. Sunday, June 30th, 2024 would go down in the record books for tropical meteorology, as many records were about to be barreled through. Behind the scenes, I had been working on setting up an interview with Weather Girl Danny, one of the largest weather creators on YouTube and likely the biggest weather YouTube channel in Jamaica. Since Jamaica was in the cone and we had discussed the storm quite a lot both publicly and privately, she was the perfect person to interview. However, while we were setting it up, Beryl became a major hurricane at 8 a.m. that morning, and since it was the most recent news, we discussed that first before discussing the impacts on the Windward Islands and Jamaica, as they were increasingly in the line of fire. What's your biggest thing you would tell people right now that they're seeing this whole thing? What should they be doing, and what's your take on this in general? Let's start with that.
Well, I mean, the key thing right now is really to prepare, because there's just today. After today, like, there's no going back. There's no doing additional things to get ready. It's really now when people should be ensuring that they have all their plans in place. If they're in areas that flood very easily, if they're near the coast, now is the time to get out and listen to the officials there.
What's your take right now with what's going on with the potential threat to Jamaica?
Well, I definitely think that there could be a problem for us, because I mean, it would all be dependent on the intensity of Beryl. Like, if it surpasses what the NHC shows in the realm of the intensity of it, if it becomes a stronger Category 4 hurricane than what they're expecting, I believe that we could have anywhere between a Category 2, Category 3 hurricane, if not being very close to landfall, being close enough to allow for some watches and even some warnings to be issued.
As hurricane hunters were also investigating the system, they found something that shocked everyone from the Windward Islands to the U.S. coast. At 11:35 a.m., the NHC put out an emergency update indicating that Beryl was now a Category 4 hurricane with winds of 130 miles per hour, rapidly approaching Barbados and the Grenadine Islands. Yesterday afternoon, it was a 65 mile per hour tropical storm. Now it is a 130 mile per hour Category 4 hurricane approaching the Lesser Antilles. You heard that right. This is now a Category 4 hurricane in the month of June. This has not happened before, I believe. This is the strongest hurricane on record in June of hurricane season. The worst case scenario had played out in front of us, and now, instead of preparing for maybe a Category 1 or 2 hurricane at most, many in the Windwards now had to prepare for a Category 4. However, as one gut-churning development occurred, another one was not too far behind. Beryl had begun to undergo an Eyewall replacement cycle in the afternoon of June 30th. This was a massive issue that I highlighted previously, but that evening on stream, we elaborated on that more as the Barbados radar was showing a second Eyewall developing. However, as the night went on, the structure of Beryl improved on satellite again, so we were looking at any possible weakness that could help us determine when the cycle would end. We were noticing a slight increase in wind shear impacting the eastern side of the storm as Beryl fired off a lot of convection on that side to protect its core.
Somebody was asking about the potential for rapid intensification before the islands. So what the HWRF right now shows, they show it right now with a pressure at 956 and winds of 130, which is pretty accurate to what we have right now. They show it weakening down to about 120 miles per hour, but then it starts to re-intensify, and it has it having a near landfall, possibly even landfalling over some of the islands here, some of the smaller ones, at 140 miles per hour.
As the stream concluded, the Eyewall replacement cycle was well underway, but after it ended, something shocking began to develop. There are two types of Eyewall replacement cycles, a classic and a merger. A classic is when an entire new eyewall around the hurricane develops and begins to choke out the inner eyewall and results in a much larger but weaker system. This also tends to push out the wind field, which could make storm surge and impacts even worse than before, as instead of a more localized area of destruction, it's now more widespread. An infamous example of this was Hurricane Maria back in 2017, as it was impacting Puerto Rico. A merger, on the other hand, is when an outer eyewall partially develops, and then it merges with the inner eyewall, generally leaving the inner eyewall structure intact, while expanding it maybe a little bit, and the intensity doesn't decrease nearly as much. In some cases, it doesn't weaken at all. A great example of this, the multiple eyewall replacement cycles Hurricane Irma underwent as it went through the main development region before striking the Lesser Antilles. The eyewall replacement cycle that Beryl went through on June 30th was a merger, and how it developed shocked many in Storms United. Within 4 hours of the cycle beginning, the new eyewall began to merge with the inner eyewall, and by 2 a.m., the cycle had 99% completed. A process that normally takes 18 to 24 hours only took 6 for Beryl, and seeing how quickly it completed it was terrifying. This not only meant that the system was ready to go and was more organized than ever, but it had the opportunity to strengthen even more before landfall in the Windward Islands. This also meant that a Category 5 hurricane was very much on the table, as after the Windward Islands, it still has a day and a half of low wind shear and incredibly warm sea surface temperatures to strengthen to that intensity. After weakening back to a 120 mile per hour Category 3 hurricane due to the cycle, Beryl was as healthy as ever, and it would undergo its most consequential phase of rapid intensification. Starting at 8 a.m., on July 1st, Beryl re-strengthened to a 130 mile per hour Category 4 hurricane as it approached the island of Carriacou in the Grenadine Islands. As the eyewall began to approach the island, the system continued to strengthen quickly, and at 11:10 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time, Beryl made landfall in Carriacou, making it the strongest hurricane in recorded history to make landfall in July. Carriacou sustained a near-apocalyptic hit from Beryl, with catastrophic damage across the island reported in the days after the impact. As Beryl barreled through the Windward Islands, it caused major damage to much of the Grenadine Islands, Grenada, and Trinidad and Tobago. However, the intensification wasn't done. As the hurricane moved into the Caribbean Sea, it became an annular hurricane, which is a rare feature only reserved for the strongest hurricanes. An annular hurricane is as perfect of a hurricane structure as you can get, which consists of a symmetric eye and a symmetric storm complex around the eye. On the afternoon of July 1st, Beryl reached that status as hurricane hunters continued to investigate the system. By 8 p.m., the first Category 5 readings were detected by the hurricane hunters, but the NHC decided not to pull the trigger just yet and declare the system a Category 5 hurricane, waiting for more evidence. They wouldn't have to wait for very long, as multiple dropsons corresponded with the increase in intensity, and at 11 p.m. on July 1st, history was made once again. Beryl was a Category 5 hurricane, making it the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record, beating out 2005's Hurricane Emily by 16 days. Advisory is taking a while to delay, but we have it on the website, 160. This is the earliest Category 5 hurricane in history, in recorded history, ladies and gentlemen. Last night, it was the earliest recorded history of the Category 4. Tonight, now it's a Category 5. History has been made, unfortunately, in the Caribbean Sea because it's surrounded by land. Beryl would then break Emily's record for strongest hurricane recorded in July 3 hours later, strengthening up to 165 miles per hour. Beryl was an absolute monster, a titan that matched no other storm before it, mainly because of how early in the season this happened. While this intensity is impressive, it is very likely that Beryl was even stronger at its peak during the overnight hours of July 2nd. Based on recon data, including flight level winds, SFMR readings, and dropson data, Beryl was likely a 175 mile per hour hurricane at this time. The structure of Beryl was at its absolute peak, with one of the best structures for a hurricane that I have ever seen. However, until the postseason analysis, we will not know for sure if this was the case, but you can absolutely make a very strong case to the NHC that it was a 175 mile per hour system instead of 165 at its peak. As impressive as this storm has been so far, wind shear finally began to impact the storm on the morning of July 2nd, and it slowly began to weaken. At 2 p.m., it weakened back down to a high-end Category 4 hurricane as it approached Jamaica. While some weakening was anticipated, it was still expected to impact the island at high-end Category 3 or low-end Category 4 intensity. Once again, Beryl bucked the consensus, as even though wind shear was chipping at the structure of the storm and it wasn't as healthy as it was previously, Beryl kept fighting back. The shear did absolutely nothing to the storm as it approached Jamaica as a high-end Category 4 hurricane with winds of 150 miles per hour that evening. Beryl would begin to impact Jamaica in the overnight hours of July 3rd as a 145 mile per hour hurricane, but thankfully for the island, it never made landfall. While Beryl came extremely close numerous times to making landfall, it stayed just offshore, although the southern end of the island did get the eyewall of Beryl. Eventually, after 12 agonizing hours in Jamaica, Beryl began to move out of the area and enter the northwestern Caribbean Sea. However, after fighting the wind shear in the region for so long and sustaining its strength during that time, Beryl finally began to weaken quickly. Beryl would lose major hurricane status on July 4th as it approached the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, but briefly regained that in the evening. Beryl would then make landfall in Tulum, Mexico at 6:05 a.m. on July 5th as a high-end Category 2 hurricane with winds of 110 miles per hour. Beryl then began to weaken rapidly due to land interaction and would enter the Gulf of Mexico as a tropical storm on July 6th. By this point, Beryl was a shell of its former self, and while it did begin to reorganize again, this time it would take much longer than anticipated. The mid-level circulation and the low-level circulation separated while Beryl was over the Yucatan Peninsula, and until they aligned, rapid strengthening was impossible. The system also was battling dry air that finally got into the core of the system, which slowed down the organization further. The system would take over 24 hours to reorganize and start to re-strengthen, but it was a much slower pace than before until it approached Texas that evening. Beryl regained hurricane strength one last time at 11 p.m. Central Daylight Time, and it continued to strengthen as it made its final approach to Matagorda Bay, Texas. Finally, at 4 a.m. Central Daylight Time on July 8th, Beryl made landfall near Matagorda, Texas, officially as an 80 mile per hour Category 1 hurricane, although based on surface observations and reports of stronger winds, there is a very strong chance that it was a 90 mile per hour high-end Category 1 hurricane at landfall. Once again, we've got to wait until the NHC postseason analysis. Beryl quickly weakened as it moved through Texas, Louisiana, and across much of the country. Beryl also produced a total of 68 tornadoes across much of the United States, making this the largest tornado outbreak generated by a tropical cyclone in recorded history. While this was going on, Beryl weakened to a tropical depression near Tyler, Texas, became post-tropical on July 9th over Kentucky, and it would eventually dissipate on July 11th over Ontario, Canada. The impacts that Beryl had across the areas it impacted, as well as the weather community at large, cannot be understated. Beryl broke over a dozen records, from intensity records to tropical tornado records. It also reinforced the possibility for many of the 2024 hurricane season being a hyperactive one, as Beryl acted as a tone setter for the rest of the hurricane season. However, looking at the impacts of those unfortunate enough to get caught into this storm, it was far worse than a lot of people realize. In Carriacou, the damage was near apocalyptic, with all vegetation stripped from the island and the marinas suffering extensive damage or just being destroyed altogether. Over 90% of the homes here, as well as the rest of the Grenadine Islands, were damaged or destroyed, with the vast majority of them being unlivable after the storm. In total, 14 people were killed in the Windward Islands from Beryl, 8 in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and 6 in Grenada. The damage estimated in Grenada and Carriacou was $430 million, which may not seem that much compared to the damage figures elsewhere, but for context, and especially for a country like Grenada, it was nearly 1/3 of their GDP, which was at $1.32 billion as of 2023. The damage in St. Vincent and the Grenadines totaled at $300 million, which is nearly 30% of their GDP. In Jamaica, the damage was extensive, but because the eye stayed offshore, it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been. Damage to agriculture and infrastructure was extensive due to major flash floods that hit much of the island, and over 400,000 people were left without power. The damage was the worst on the southern side of the island and in the mountain valleys due to extensive flash flooding. For Danny, the damage was minimal where she was at, but it still knocked out power for many areas, and it took several days for the internet to be restored. Recovery efforts were underway after Beryl passed, and some areas had to wait for up to 2 weeks for power and internet services to be restored. The total damage cost was around $41 million, and 4 people were killed in Jamaica. Had Beryl made landfall and the Eyewall came closer to shore, it would have undoubtedly been much worse, but thankfully it was not the case. In the United States, damage ranged from straight-line winds to tropical tornado impacts to flash flooding. In Texas, the Eyewall went right over Houston, which resulted in 2.7 million people losing power due to Beryl in the metro area. Up to 13 inches of rain fell in parts of the area as well, which caused flash flooding concerns for many areas in Texas and Louisiana. Tropical tornadoes also wreaked havoc across much of the United States, with Louisiana getting the lion's share of the tornadoes. 25 tornadoes were confirmed in Louisiana, including 6 EF2s, which are quite powerful coming from tropical cyclones. The strongest tornado of the outbreak was an EF3 tornado that struck Mount Vernon, Indiana, which tells you how widespread the impacts were. In total, 48 people were killed by Beryl in the United States, with $7.2 billion in damages occurring, and because of the impacts Beryl brought to the United States, it quickly overshadowed the impacts in the Caribbean. Hurricane Beryl was a once-in-a-lifetime type of storm, a storm that started out as one of the healthiest tropical waves I'd ever seen to becoming a monster hurricane before it even hit the Lesser Antilles. The craziest part about Beryl were the insane records it kept breaking in every area possible. While Beryl was seen as a tone setter for a potentially hyperactive hurricane season, I was just in disbelief at what I had seen for several days on end. To close off, Beryl was a storm where both sides of the coin were present. On one hand, you had the records, the rate of intensification, and the textbook shots of an annular hurricane, which is what makes meteorology and weather so great. On the other hand, you look at the destruction it left behind, especially for areas that were not expecting a hurricane this early in the season, and some areas were not adequately prepared for it. Hurricane Beryl will always be an interesting storm to look back at, especially once the postseason analysis is complete and we get the true extent of the storm's strength and likely name retirement from the hurricane list. It was also the hurricane that put Storms United on the map and made us a respectable group of weather enthusiasts and forecasters for future extreme weather. With that being said, I will go ahead and close out this documentary. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. It helps us out and helps us get more people engaged with weather, and it is much appreciated. If you'd like to know more about Storms United and our coverage, be sure to join our Discord server at the end screen or in the description down below. With that being said, have a wonderful day. Stay safe.